today is talking about the arrival of the five Rafale fighter jets. They took off from France yesterday. They will be landing at the Ambala Air Force Base tomorrow, and they will become a part of the Indian Air Force. Now, the experts, the analysts, everyone will tell you that the arrival of the five Rafale jets, it will strengthen the Air Force, it will strengthen the armed forces, and they aren't wrong. But we're going to look at the larger picture today. We are going to go beyond Rafales, and we're going to talk about the problem India, the government, and the armed forces have every time there is a crisis. Today, the arrival of Rafale jets is not being celebrated for what they bring to the table, that they do, but what they mean in the current crisis. And this is where our problem is. Every time there is a crisis, our government, our armed forces, they swing into action and they go for what we call emergency fast track procurements, or EFTPs. Now, these are urgent imports of weapons, of ammunition even. And this is where the problem is. That to secure India, we cannot always rely on emergency FTPs. And this is what we're going to discuss today. Now, if you turn back the clock a bit, in June, earlier this year, just 24th June, Rajnath Singh was in Russia. Our defense minister was in Russia for the Victory Day parade. But along with him, there was a defense secretary, there was an array of senior bureaucrats who were discussing with relevant companies, officials, and people in the country about more defense procurements as we were approaching a crisis with China. But this is not the first time that India is in the middle of a crisis and it's going for emergency fast-track procurements. In 1999, while we were in the middle of the Kargil War, the 155mm Bofors gun, that was being used in the Batalic sector. The military was using that gun. Now, that gun required 250 shells every day. We had a number of senior bureaucrats touring the world looking for shells for that gun. So we were running out of ammunition. After the surgical strikes that were a response to the Uri terrorist attack, and after the Balakot airstrikes too, the government was swinging into action to make some urgent defense imports. Now, why is this happening? Why is there always the factor of emergency FTPs? Why do we wait for a crisis to up the ante for our defense needs? There are four factors we are going to look at today. One, that the defense procurement system is broken. Second, we have no long-term planning or goals when it comes to meeting our defense needs. Number three is the underused public sector capacity, which has a lot to do with the ammunition part we are going to discuss. And lastly, the absent private sector, the absent local private sector. Now, I'll come to these factors one by one. Now, one is the defense procurement system, the broken defense procurement system. Now, since we're talking about Rafales, the first need, the need for the fighter planes was first felt after the Kargil War, which was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. It took 20 years for the Rafales to come to India. Now, you can blame a number of reasons. You can say it was because of the politicization of the issue. You can say it was because of the bureaucracy. You can put the blame on a number of factors. But the bottom line is that our cumbersome bureaucratic process actually hinders the procurement. And it becomes a problem for the armed forces at the end, because they are the ones responsible for guarding the borders, for securing the borders. Now, the broken procurement system is one factor. The second factor is the absence of any long-term planning. Now, one would expect that after Kargil in 1999, if our senior bureaucrats were looking around for shells for Bofors gun, the government would have learned its lessons. The successive governments would have learned their lessons. They haven't. There's no long-term planning even now. And that is one problem. Even now, we look for a crisis. We await a crisis before we swing into action to make those procurements. The third problem, and this has a lot to do with the ammunition, because we're just not importing our defense equipment, we're also importing our ammunition, and this is a big problem. That has a lot to do with the third problem, which is the underused public sector capacity. Now, if I look at my notes, the shortfalls in the army, in the military forces, they are because of the Ordnance Factory Board, which have 41 factories to keep the supply lines running, but they're not performing up to the mark. In 2015, in fact, a CAG report said that 74% of the 170 types of ammunition, they fail to meet the minimum acceptable risk level, and only 10% the war wastage reserve requirements. So somewhere our underused public sector capacity is hampering our ammunition stock. So that's why we have to import from other countries, creating further dependencies. A significant quantity of the Army's demand for principal ammunition items, they were outstanding as of March 31, 2018. So this is where the third problem is, our underused public sector capacity, which makes us vulnerable, not just for our defense machinery, but also for ammunition. The last factor, the absent private sector. Now, in 2014, we had a glimmer of hope when the Prime Minister spoke very proudly about the idea of Make in India, that we'll make more in India and a lot of companies will come and make in India. And this was supposed to be about strengthening our armed forces. But this habit, this routine of going for fast track procurements every time a crisis is there, doesn't let the private sector grow. And hence, you do not have any private sector in the big manufacturing. You are still importing your missiles from, let's say, in Israel. You're importing your fighter jets from France. And this keeps the private sector out of the loop. So that is why, for even the armed forces, even for the government, going for emergency FTPs is better than long-term capacity building locally. And this is the fourth problem. Because tomorrow, if we have another crisis, say, with China or with Pakistan, due to the absence of any capacity building locally, we'll be again vulnerable to defense imports. Now, one could say that the arrivals of Rafale is going to be a silver bullet, but in the larger scheme of things, it is not. If the country is still importing its defense equipment, if it's still importing its ammunition, the vulnerability is there. And this is one problem that requires fixing. One can hope that the arrival of the 5 Rafale jets and the other Rafale jets later this year, they serve as a reminder to the government that while we can always import from our friends, from our allies, from any other country in the world, it's always important to go for local capacity building. Because securing India is far, far more complex and complicated than just getting 5 Rafale jets. Thank you so much.